Hello, everybody. Welcome to the third installment of our talk about studying music overseas. Today, I am very, very excited to have as our guest, Mr. Roberto Diaz, or should I say President and CEO Roberto Diaz from the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia, one of the most renowned and prestigious music educational institutions in the world. So thank you so much for getting up early to be with our audiences in the evening in Hong Kong. Yeah, I'd like to just jump in then, if you don't mind, because
Great.
I think our guest today has basically done everything in the music world. You know, you are a soloist, chamber musician, pedagogue, orchestral principal, and now president leading this institution. So yeah, can you tell us about perhaps just your various roles on stage and behind the stage and in the office, everywhere? And how do you balance that?
Great. Well, first of all, thank you, Trey, for inviting me and having me here with your audiences. It's a great pleasure to have the chance to speak with you and the folks listening in on this. I think it's very interesting because my career has evolved, if you will, in a what I think is a fairly natural way. I never really thought of myself as a musician, as a person that would do, one thing. And, it's always been for me sort of a balance between different types of activities. I always played chamber music. I love doing it. I did it a lot when I was in school, both at Curtis and before that at New England Conservatory. Now I am part of a professional string trio, which I have been for a lot of years. I've always taught. I started teaching, pretty much the minute I left school. I started teaching at home a little bit at first, and then, depending on where I lived. When I was in Boston, I taught at the Boston Conservatory. When I went to Washington, D.C., I taught at Peabody Conservatory and at the University of Maryland. Then I taught at Houston at Rice University for a year. And then when I came to Philadelphia, after a few years in the Philadelphia Orchestra, I started teaching at Curtis, teaching viola at Curtis. And so I've always had this sort of teaching component. Like I said, chamber music. I spent 20 years in four great American orchestras: Minnesota, Boston, Washington, and then Philadelphia. And I've always been very lucky to have the opportunity to play on my own, to play as a soloist. As a violist, it's not really practical to think of making a living as a soloist. But I think in combination with other activities, it's a very rewarding way to, explore repertoire and actually to be able to commission new pieces for the viola as a solo instrument. And so it's always been that way for me. And so at one point, about 14 or so years ago, when the Board of Trustees of Curtis, where I was teaching, asked me to consider this position as president of the school, it wasn't really something that I considered doing as a sort of career, but it was more like a call to service. It's an institution that we all love. Those of us who have been a part of Curtis, we love the school. And it was, in a sense, a little bit like what Rudolf Serkin did and Gary Graffman and Ephraim Zimbalist. It was just to serve the school in this capacity for a while. Like I said, it's been 14, 15 years now. But, also the fact that if you look at some of these people that I mentioned, Serkin and Graffman, Zimbalist, they all had a very active performing career while they were the director or president of the
Right.
school, which I think is the reason that I was able to say, okay, I'm happy to do this. And I had been, in orchestras for at that point, like 20 years, and so I thought this seems like a very natural, progression, if you will.
Mhm.
And it's been a lot of fun. I mean, it's been very interesting. It's hard. It's a lot of work. The institution has grown quite a bit in the last 14 years or so, and it's become a lot more complex. Our budgets have grown, almost doubled in size, and so it's been a lot of work, but it's really interesting work. And I would say it's my responsibilities at Curtis are a lot more like the responsibilities of the music director of an orchestra than they are like the responsibilities of the president of the orchestra.
Okay.
Although, I do have the title of president and CEO. That title, actually, the CEO part had never been part of the directorship or presidency of the school before. There was always sort of a business person. And there still is. That's not something that I have any expertise in. So I rely on somebody that's, the chief financial officer. But the board thought that, all of the responsibilities should be placed on one person. So,
Okay.
so
Wow.
it's been a learning experience. It's been fun. It's hard, and it's very rewarding.
Yeah, I mean, you've touched on actually so many points I'd like to ask you about, but I think,
Sure.
Having all the different really interesting experiences that you have, I think now maybe we can even go back a bit, because people might want to know, how did you get into this? Because, for example, when you were young and looking for a teacher or where to go to school, how was that process for you? Because certainly that helped to shape, your career later and life and all these big decisions you've made.
Since we're going back, I should start by saying that my parents were both professional musicians.
Okay.
And my father, is now retired, but he was a professional violist. And, he had a very distinguished career. We're from Chile. I am from Chile originally. And my father actually came to the States, to the US, in 1966 to study with William Primrose at Indiana University. And, I was 5 or 6 years old at the time, and so the whole family came, and so I got to meet Primrose, apparently. I don't remember. Which is interesting, just as an aside, because the viola that I play on now is actually the Primrose Amati viola. So the viola that I have is a viola that Primrose, played for the first half of his career, actually. But anyway, so, after that year with the Fulbright scholarship at Indiana, we went back to Chile because my father was, the principal violist of the orchestra there and so forth. But a few years later, my father decided that it was a good idea for the family to come back to the States. And so he was offered a position in the Atlanta Symphony in Atlanta, Georgia. And so my high school education actually happened here in the States. And it was during that time that, of course, my father started to think about, where I should go to college. And there was a friend of his in the Atlanta Symphony.
You were already very serious about going into music, or?
Actually, I became serious when we came to the States.
Okay.
When I studied violin when we lived in Chile. And we did it because my parents, like I said, both being musicians, they thought that a musical education was very important for us, but not necessarily thinking that it should become a career. But the musical education was something that, there was no choice in our house. So my brother played the cello, my sister played the piano and the guitar, I played the violin and so forth. But when we came to the States, my first love, which was playing soccer, became a little bit of a disappointment, because in the early 70s, you know, people in this country didn't really think about soccer the way that it was thought of in South America. And so, you know, it was a little bit of a disappointment for me to play soccer in high school. It resembled more a rugby game than it did a soccer game. And you know, so that interest sort of waned a little bit. But then I started playing the viola. My father decided that since I was physically big enough to handle a small viola as opposed to a violin with viola strings, that I should try playing the viola. And actually, I think it was both this interest in the viola and the sort of the losing interest in sports that made it so that it really caught on. And so through my high school years, I really decided that music was something that I was much more serious about. And then, like I said, a friend of my father's at the orchestra, who had gone to New England Conservatory, talked to my dad and said, you know, there is an excellent viola teacher at New England Conservatory, and he happened to be the principal violist of the Boston Symphony. Burton Fine is his name. You
Yes.
probably know him from your Harvard days. And so, you know, it was because of my father getting to know Mr. Fine, as I always knew him, and listening to his recordings. And he said, you know, you really should think about studying with this man. And so I went and I auditioned for New England when the time was right. And he accepted me. And so, you know, when I picked the school, really, I picked the school because of the teacher.
Right.
You know, and so that was a very important thing for me. When my brother, who also attended New England Conservatory, very much went because of Larry Lesser.
Me
You know,
too.
well, you know, so you see, it's like the teacher is a very important part of this decision. You know, and then when I finished during my last year at New England, it was actually Burton, my teacher at New England, that said, you know, I think it would be very good for you to spend a little time with Joseph de Pasquale. And Joseph de Pasquale had been his predecessor in the Boston Symphony. He was principal violist of the Boston Symphony. But then Joe came from Boston to Philadelphia as principal violist, and that's when Burton got the job in Boston. And it was Burton that said to me, I think it would be good for you to be around him for a little while. And so you should audition for Curtis. So again, it was the teacher. It wasn't really the school, but it was the teacher that and so I auditioned for Curtis because that's where Joe taught. And he accepted me. And so I came to Curtis for a couple of years to study with him.
And so while you were studying, because, you know, before you were talking about, besides performing, you started teaching a lot also, and that was always something you did. And then on top of that, now as president, did you feel like you had to were there any preparations from your studies that helped you with all these new phases in your career, or what that was just developing naturally as you went along and you sort of pick up skills?
I think that it was more the latter. You know, you kind of pick up the skills as you go along. I think, you know, one of the things, I remember having a conversation with Wolfgang Sawallisch, who was the music director of the Philadelphia Orchestra, who actually hired me to come to Philly. You know, Sawallisch and I, when we met, before I ever even auditioned for the orchestra, we talked a lot about teaching and, you know, how much one actually oneself learns from teaching. Because what you actually have to do when you teach is you actually have to explain, verbalize, and justify your advice.
Justify. That's very
Well, yeah, I mean,
good.
why am I asking you to do this? And, because people should say, okay, not just because you said so, but like, how should I think about this? And so you have to actually justify it in what you see written, or what you know about the background, or the basis of, the context, if you will. And so you learn a tremendous amount, actually. And every once in a while, I promise you, to this day, I think to myself when I'm practicing, I should follow my own advice once in a while. Because I remember, in the Bartok concerto saying to somebody, I think, you should think of this passage in this way. And then if I'm practicing the Bartok concerto, sometimes it occurs to me, I should do what I said you should do in this play. I should think about that. So you learn, I think that's how you collect experiences in a sense. I think that being the principal violist, both at the National Symphony when Rostropovich was the music director, and then being the principal violist of the Philadelphia Orchestra when Savalas and then Eschenbach were the music directors, you are in a sense the representative and the sort of the liaison, if you will, between your section and the music director, and you represent your section amongst other principals of the string section and of the orchestra. And so you have to learn to advocate for your section, advocate for yourself, advocate for the orchestra. And also when I joined the Philadelphia Orchestra, the orchestra had just agreed to have 3 musicians represent the orchestra at the board of trustee level, in the board of trustees. And so, after a couple of years in the Philadelphia Orchestra, I actually was asked to be one of these representatives, one of the 3 orchestra members on the board of trustees. And so I did that, and for 3 years I served on the board of trustees, and 2 out of those 3 years I was also on the executive committee of the board of trustees, which was really eye-opening. I mean, I learned a lot, from seeing sort of the inner workings of how, the trustees work in an institution like that in this country.
Actually,
so,
sorry, go ahead.
No, so actually that was, you start to collect these experiences, and you learn. I mean, you learn a lot from being there and seeing things and hearing conversations and seeing how decisions are made, or what a group of trustees really is concerned with, and how they navigate supporting an institution without getting in the way of running it, right. And so I learned a lot, and I think it was some of these experiences that really were extremely helpful for me as far as the work that I do now at Curtis, as far as working with the trustees and working with the management of the school and so forth, and the faculty.
Yeah, I think I remember also when I was studying that you think, you're at a conservatory, you're going to learn everything you need to know for your career here. But a lot of times, like you're saying, we're learning things after we finish our studies. Maybe sometimes you even learn more afterward. So I think this is I'm going to also throw in some questions from our listeners as we go along.
Sure. Of course.
You mentioned orchestra. You had such amazing orchestral experiences in Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, and Minnesota, and working probably with all the biggest names in conducting and soloists. We have a couple of questions. I think I know where they're coming from, which is, to put it more diplomatically, is orchestra class really necessary? But I think for me, if I were to ask that, it would be more about how do I get the most out of orchestra class? Because if I'm just practicing my solo stuff all day and then I got to go spend 3 hours in orchestra, you feel like, oh, you know, I have my exams coming up. But maybe, do you think orchestra class could help that even?
There's absolutely no question about it. You know, we think that, you know, and this is something that we talk about at Curtis a lot, you know, is, well, you know, if a young violinist comes into the school, and I'm not saying that everybody thinks this way, but, you know, they think like, well, I'm not going to be an orchestra player, so why do I have to spend time doing something that I have no interest in, or it's a skill set that I don't need? And, you know, there is so much more to learn at orchestra than just how you play in the orchestra. First of all, musically, it's incredibly important because it makes you realize that, you know, you're not going to spend the rest of your life playing by yourself. Because even if you want to be a soloist, you're going to need the orchestra. So having an understanding of how an orchestra works is ultimately going to be very musically helpful to you when you make decisions about how to play as a soloist.
Great point.
Having the experience of playing in an orchestra when there is a soloist, you're going to learn a lot about the do's and don'ts of what the soloist should and shouldn't do. You know, how do you project as a soloist when you play? Because if you play a certain way, there's nothing the orchestra can do to help you. If you know, if your rhythm is very rhapsodic, let's put it, you know, if your sense of rhythm is rather rhapsodic, there's nothing an orchestra can do. A pianist can follow that in a way that an orchestra cannot. You know, I always say to people, you know, playing with an orchestra has certain challenges, and then there are certain things about playing with an orchestra that make it much easier than playing with a piano. But one of the things is that a piano can follow you almost instantly. If you have a good pianist, you know, they can make adjustments very quickly. It's almost like a speedboat, yeah? But an orchestra is more like an ocean liner, you know? It's going to turn. If you want to slow down, they will slow down, but then they won't just come back up suddenly. They can't do that. An orchestra doesn't do that. A pianist can. You understand? Right. And so you have to be very aware of what it's like to play in an orchestra and what an orchestra can and cannot do. So there are a lot of experiences that you can learn from that. Now, I think that one of the most important experiences that we get out of orchestral training is the fact that, you know, you're not in it for yourself. The good of the group is the most important thing, is not the whim of the individual. And I think that the skill of collaboration and knowing who you need to be listening to at any given moment are skills that you will never learn by yourself.
Right.
And so, you know, and how to interpret, if you will, what somebody's asking you to do with the baton. You know, when they put their hand out and say a little less, how much less is less? You have to use your judgment. You don't all of a sudden drop out. That's not what they're asking for. So, you know, and when you're a soloist, you need to be listening and watching to what's going on, because you have to also react to what is being asked for. So it's not just I'm the soloist and you follow me and that's the end of the story. So, you know, making music is a lot more of a collaborative art than we may think when we're practicing our Tchaikovsky concerto.
Yeah, so in fact, it sounds like, I mean, this is such an important point you're making, that it sounds like for students, in fact, when they go to their orchestral class now, they should be really, really busy, because there's so much to look for and to learn from, because you're not at all just focusing, or you should not be focusing on your.
And I think that if you go into the orchestra program with an attitude of, I will have the opportunity to learn from this things that I will not be able to learn anywhere else, then actually you can get a tremendous amount from it, you know. And I can tell you that some of the most satisfying musical experiences of my life have actually been orchestral concerts, not necessarily a concerto performance.
Mm.
You know, because the power of an orchestra, when everybody is really in the zone, and you can feel it on stage, when an orchestra just turns into something much greater than the sum of its parts, it's thrilling in a way that you just can't recreate that by yourself. You just can't. You know, and so it can be an experience that's really quite illuminating and amazing. And it would be a shame for someone who wants to be a well-rounded and well-educated musician to not have had that experience. And you know, we don't need to get into it too much unless there's a question about it, but you know, the value of chamber music is I mean, that's a whole world right there. You know, the skills that you have to develop as a chamber musician, you know, how you give advice, how you take advice, you know, how do you, I mean, you build skills that will be with you for the rest of your life. You know, how do you relate to people? You said no because I don't want to. I mean, how collaborate, you know, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing that. You know, I mean, it's like, well, how
in school, isn't it? That, or you should.
I'm sorry?
This is something else you should be learning at school.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you know, I mean, think about it. We try at Curtis to make it so that, you know, pianists who tend to be more lonely, you know, players, you know, because they're, you know, a lot of times they're just in the room by themselves, you know, and you know, so a lot of times we say to them, you know, when your buddy, the other pianist, is playing the Chopin concerto, you should play the orchestra part for them. And then when you're playing your Tchaikovsky concerto, they should actually play the orchestra part for you. Because you will learn more from trying to, you know, support with the orchestral score somebody doing something in a Chopin concerto. You will learn more from that than you actually do from learning the solo part of the Chopin concerto. You know, and if you just cannot follow what they're doing, then you better pay attention to that.
Very,
you know?
Very interesting. Yeah. Actually.
And it makes you think, you know, like, there are limits to what you can do, because if you just cannot follow what they're doing, chances are if you do the same thing, nobody will be able to follow you either. And so
fact,
that spirit of like learning from the other side. And it's a little bit like, you know, what we talk about with the orchestral training, you know? So, so I think it's just building awareness.
Yeah, actually, you know, we have more and more questions coming in now. And speaking of learning certain skills at school, you know, we have one question, and I'd like to sort of add to it, which is they're wondering what is the appropriate age to start a Bachelor of Music. But I think maybe on top of that, it's perhaps also a question about, besides music, your principal instrumental studies with a teacher, what else, for example, at Curtis, do you feel is as important or just very important for their development? Academics, certainly, like you said, orchestra, chamber music, music history and theory, but anything else, do you think?
You know, that's a very interesting question in many ways. When I became director of Curtis, this is in 2006, the mission statement of the school was to train incredibly gifted young musicians. So it was really a training school. It was a trade school. We were just training people to do something, to play the piano. We were training them to be a violinist. We were training them to sing. We were, you know, and very soon after that, we did a strategic plan, you know, which is, you know, for your listeners, this is when you decide that, what is the purpose of the next 5 years? What do we want to accomplish in the next 5 years? And pretty soon we started to look at this mission statement of the school, which had been around for 80 years at that point. And we realized that we weren't really serving our students as well as we should, because we weren't really educating them, we were just training them. Oh. And how successful can a somewhat educated artist be? Like, what sense of curiosity, special intellectual curiosity, and I would even take it one step further and say, can anyone name one great artist in any discipline that wasn't intellectually curious? When you hear about, what Picasso thought about, or what Matisse thought about, or, Van Gogh, or in any other discipline, a writer, a poet, these people are incredibly intellectually curious because it informs what they do with their art. And if you spend time talking to people like Rostropovich and Wolfgang Sawallisch and, the biggest names in the, you realize that these people have a depth of understanding and knowledge about events, history, art, music, all kinds of things, politics, current events, they are incredibly, look at Bernstein, look at the depth of the intellect of somebody like that. And so you realize that, you can't leave sort of the education part of the equation up to somebody so that, if you have time, it'd be great if you learn how to read, not really a good idea, or writing would be helpful to you maybe at some point,
So at Curtis, have you then changed the curriculum?
We changed the mission statement of the school, and we said to educate and train exceptionally gifted young musicians for a career in music, and we took that very seriously. And so as a result of that, actually we added, we started to focus much more on the education around the performer, because we really believe that if you cannot talk about a piece, chances are you can't really play it.
Can you give some examples of like specific courses or that you think are especially interesting?
Well, we started, because Curtis is very small, there was something that we did as an experiment. And actually it turned out to be successful. And now we have done this for, 10, 12 years. And it's called the All School Project. And the All School Project is basically when we focus the year around a theme. And the theme can be a time and a place, it could be an event, it could be, a certain series of events. And so, what we do is that then we create academic classes, musical study classes, and performance programming around this theme. So like, for example, one of the things that we did was the Second Viennese School. And so, we programmed, music by, Second Viennese composers, Schoenberg and Berg, and we did Wozzeck, as part of as a part of that. But we didn't just perform the piece. We actually read the play. We studied 12-tone music. What is 12-tone music? So there you have musical studies. Then with the play, you're including liberal arts, and you're analyzing the piece musically. You're analyzing the piece contextually. You're analyzing, and what was happening in Vienna at the time that actually created these parallels where, music, art, architecture, Freud, all of these things kind of went underground at the same time. What was happening? And you could see that if you look at what was happening in Europe at the time, these cracks were starting to form, and eventually this led to a world war,
Right.
And so what was happening politically that kind of made it to what was happening in literature and poetry and psychoanalysis. So one of the classes that they did was the interpretation of dreams. They studied interpretation. So these are the kinds of things that actually put the music that you play. So when a violinist and a pianist study the Schoenberg fantasy, they have some context behind why this piece is written the way it is. And if you analyze it, you see exactly where the tone row is when it's inverted, where it's, taken and moved, in different ways. And so that informs your performance of this piece in a way that you could never have without that education behind it.
Right, rather than just training yourself to play the notes.
Well, otherwise you're just kind of reading a map and you can sort of make these sounds, but they don't really mean anything to you. So it's actually, the All School project has helped us put, music into the context of the day. We did another All School project, which was Paris between the two world wars. Everybody was in Paris between the two world wars. I mean, Picasso was there, Stravinsky was there, everybody
Hemingway,
was there.
yeah.
Hemingway was there. I mean, you name them, they were there, And so, we did classes on Hemingway, we did, studied Picasso and what was happening to art and what were some of the parallels between what Picasso was doing and what Stravinsky was doing. A lot of interesting things to, and so when you perform the Rite of Spring, it puts it in a very different light, and, the scandal that the Rite of Spring caused, was not that different from the scandal that, Picasso was creating with some of his Cubist ideas and you see some of the same parallels in literature and poetry and other forms of other disciplines. So in that sense, what this has done is that it's made it possible for us to always be creating new courses, for the students. It has created the opportunity for the students to understand that music does not exist in a vacuum. And so, we can offer, the usual musical study courses, music of the Baroque, classical period, romantic, 20th century music and so forth, but then there's also all of these other courses that can live around this, that give people a chance to really look into a little bit more depth. I mean, one of the things that we did, which I thought, well, let's see what happens, and we ended up doing it for 2 years, was Darmstadt.
Oh. Okay.
That was exactly the reaction that we got. For 2 years, we did, and so, you start looking at the literature and you start looking at the music. And so the first year was the music and the art and the literature that came from Darmstadt. And then the second year was actually the reaction to that music and that art in America.
Oh.
And so where people were sort of saying, yeah, but a melody is not a bad thing necessarily, And so you have, Copland and Bernstein and a lot of these, but it took them sort of reacting to no and, but, we did some amazing things as a result of studying Darmstadt.
So I think it's safe to say that for all our listeners who might be dreaming of going to Curtis, that if you are fortunate enough one day to get there, you need to not just be a good player, you also need some serious intellectual curiosity and a willingness to open your mind up. Well,
you won't have a lot of choice about that. because I mean,
Absolutely.
we're very committed to the fact that, you know, you need to develop this, you know, intellectual curiosity, because I think that people are curious, they just don't know it. And I think that one of the things that happens, especially to us musicians, especially when we're young, is that it takes such a tremendous amount of time and effort to learn how to play the violin, the clarinet, the piano, whatever it is, at an incredibly high level, that we almost like become very focused, and we kind of tend to ignore everything else. And look, I have to say, we see this with parents also. You know, parents a lot of times they say, well, don't worry about that, just practice.
Yeah.
You know, and so you sometimes see, you know, people that are incredibly accomplished instrumentally. I'm not going to say musically, but instrumentally, at the expense of a lot of other things. And so, you know, we feel, well, okay, Curtis, is a chance for you to become aware of the fact that there's this whole world out there that exists that is actually not a luxury, but a necessity.
Right. That's, you know, this is definitely something I think a lot of students, also in Hong Kong and China and elsewhere in Asia, they don't realize that. You're absolutely right to call it a necessity. Um, in fact, you know, now that we're talking about Curtis even in more detail, in more depth, we're getting more questions for advice from you, for example, because like you said, it's not just about instrumentally how good you are. So when somebody comes to audition, which I'm sure you've heard a lot of, what is a successful audition to you?
Well, I think that if you look at the repertoire requirements, okay, for any discipline, violin, cello, viola, piano, clarinet, whatever it is, you know, guitar. If you look at the repertoire that is asked for, it is very clear that the faculty who will be listening to the audition is looking for an awareness of a sense of style, yeah, of obviously technical accomplishment. In violin, when they ask you to play, you know, a romantic concerto, a Paganini caprice, a solo Bach, you know, a Mozart concerto, I mean, this takes a tremendous amount of instrumental ability to just be able to negotiate or navigate these demands repertoire-wise. But, you know, how do you approach, even instrumentally, not even musically, instrumentally, the difference between the Brahms violin concerto and a solo Bach sonata? You know, how do you navigate that physically different? You can't play them the same way. So everything physically, I'm not even talking musically at this point.
Right.
Physically, everything that you do physically is completely different. It's a completely different world than you would have in a Shostakovich concerto or Tchaikovsky concerto or the Brahms concerto. You know, the physicality of that is completely different. So is this person aware of that? And then right after that comes, you know, musically, does this Mozart concerto sound different stylistically than the Shostakovich concerto, or are they approaching it the same way?
Mozart,
you know,
and Shostakovich.
well, you'd be surprised sometimes. And so when you say, you know, what are they looking for? They're looking for that level of conscious awareness of the physicality of how you play different things differently, but also stylistically, how do you play certain things differently? If your Mozart concerto has a tremendously romantic approach and there's a lot of rubato and there's a lot of sliding, you know, and well, clearly it may be an interesting performance, but clearly it's uninformed in a certain way. You know, so they look for that, you know. And I always talk to my students about the fact that, you know, the physical sensation of playing a solo piece, let's say a Bach suite, a Bach cello suite, and the physical sensation of playing the Schnittke viola concerto, they don't relate. They're not in the same world. I mean, even the way you hold the instrument is different.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the way you relate to the bow and to the instrument is a completely different experience. There's nothing, you know, because you can't do what you're doing in Schnittke to Bach or vice versa, because it doesn't translate. And so, you know, your idea of rhythm is different, your idea of phrasing is different, your idea of sound world is different. You know, I mean, we get into all sorts of details, but I think that that's what the faculty is looking for, is this person aware of the fact that, you know, stylistically and sonically and physically, you know, these worlds are very, very different. And so if you look at, for example, the violin, you know, the violin requirements, a Paganini caprice is a Paganini caprice. As far as I'm concerned, it's all about the performer.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you have to perform the Paganini caprice, you know, and you have to do it with like absolutely no worry about the technical difficulties, and you just have to, you know, it's all about me, you know. Mm-hmm. When you get into the Bach and the Mozart concerto, it's something very different. I'm not so sure that I want to have you front and center. I want to hear more like what you think about how the Mozart concerto goes. The Bach is a different experience, and then if you're doing a romantic concerto, you know, then it's depending what you choose. If you pick Wieniawski or Vieuxtemps concerto, then it's a little bit more like the Paganini, but still has to have the possibility of the orchestra following you. Mm-hmm. So it's informed by that.
Yeah, this is very, very helpful advice for sure. And speaking of this, you know, having to really nail down your technique and instrumentally be so solid, I think there's also there are some questions now coming in about over practicing and injuries, especially during this time of lockdown. I think we hear that a lot of students, they're stuck at home. They just practice like crazy, and you're going to get some injuries invariably when you do things like that. Does Curtis pay attention to this much, or should people just be aware themselves? You know, are there anything that you look out for? Or?
Well, I think that, you know, first and foremost, self-awareness. You know, if your hand starts to hurt, it's telling you that something needs to be done about it. It needs something, either you're doing something that needs to change. Chances are there's too much tension. You know, I'm always a little bit weary when somebody says, I practiced 10 hours yesterday, because I don't believe, and maybe it's because I couldn't practice 10 hours if somebody threatened me to practice 10 hours. I still couldn't do it. I can play the viola for 10 hours, but I can't practice for 10 hours. And I've had to play the viola for 10 hours and sometimes more, you know, but it's not practicing. You know, that playing is playing, practicing is practicing. And so I think that we tend to confuse the two. You know, I have time, so I'm just going to sit in my bedroom or my practice room and play for 12 hours, you know, with just a few breaks. Okay, if that's what you want to do, that's fine. But you're probably not practicing, because practicing is a very different thing. And practicing is basically, and you know, this is something that we do talk about at Curtis a lot, is teaching people how to practice, how to really practice, you know, which is, I think, in many ways, something that if you learn to do that correctly, chances are you will probably not hurt yourself. You know, if you're doing really focused practice, I would find it very difficult that you would actually end up hurting yourself. Because that kind of practicing does not require you to play full tilt, you know, for 12 hours a day. It just doesn't require that. And so, you know, a question that I get a lot is, how do you practice when you have all this other stuff and you're teaching and you're running the school? And so, you know, I've had to develop a system which works for me. And I can tell you that you can do a tremendous amount of work in 10 minutes. But if I take out the viola and I just play it for 10 minutes, I probably didn't do anything. But so one system that helps me very much, and I think could be helpful for maybe some of your audience members, is before you even open the case, you ask yourself two very easy things: what and why. What am I going to practice, and why am I practicing it? What am I fixing? Yeah. And so if I have 10 minutes and I'm thinking to myself, okay, there's that Hindemith sonata, and in the second movement, there's that passage. So I know in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to focus on that passage in the Hindemith sonata. I'm not going to start playing the Hindemith sonata. I'm just going to fix something. And even more specifically, what's wrong with it? Why? And I'll say to myself, because it's out of tune. Okay. So I'm going to fix intonation in those 4 measures for the next 10 minutes. I can promise you, you will not hurt yourself. And I can promise you that in 10 minutes, it will be better in tune. And you know what? I can live with that. But I can also tell you that I could play as fast as I want to that Hindemith sonata for 12 hours, and it will not be better. But my hands will hurt.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, this is really the old saying, right? Quality over quantity. Truly. It truly is. Yeah.
And learning how to practice. And then look, and I don't mean this in any way, I'm not being judgmental in any way, but we do see occasionally, because we do have very young students at Curtis. And by that, I mean people that are, 10 years old, 12 years old, 14 years old, violinists, pianists, occasionally a cellist, violists now also. And a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times, these young musicians, that are so incredibly accomplished at such an early age, a lot of times, and I said not always, but a lot of times, they've had somebody helping them practice. Somebody has been sort of saying, okay, fix that. Okay, repeat this. Let's do it one more time. And so they've had like sort of a practice coach, and there's nothing wrong with that. The only downside to that is that they've never really learned to listen, analyze and correct, because somebody's been doing that for them. You understand? And so sitting at the piano and listening to something, and you've never really had to listen to it critically and say, well, this is not working because, and then you have to say, well, it's either a technical thing or it's a musical thing. I don't know, whatever it is. And then how do I fix that is the next thing you have to think about. Well, sometimes these young players have had somebody doing that thinking for them. And so we have situations where, we have to sort of talk to people. And this is not just a young person's thing. It could be somebody that went through high school and had a certain amount of this, So they're very accomplished in how they perform something because they're very talented, but they haven't developed the critical skills that you need to be able to actually teach yourself something. Mm-hmm. And for me, I've always said this, our role as a teacher is actually to teach the student to teach themselves. Because eventually you will not have your teacher anymore. And if you don't know how to teach yourself a new piece, then that's a very scary thought.
Yes, it is.
It's like, well, I have to learn this new concerto. Like, how does one choose fingerings? I don't know. I always just did the fingerings my teacher gave me. It's like, well, you should have learned. And so, the way I teach usually is I don't necessarily at first just say, here's my music, copy it, play it. It's, let's see what you can do with this. Let's see how you start to decipher this. And then let's let's start to talk about it. You know, and I may say to someone, look, I can tell you from experience that if you stand up in front of an orchestra and do that in the Walton Concerto, the orchestra will push you off the stage. You cannot do that because the oboe player will turn blue waiting for you to get to the next note. You cannot do that, you know? And so, you know, we can talk about things like that and say, are you sure you want to do that? Because if you slow down that much here, how are you going to get the tempo back up? Because an orchestra is not just going to jump.
This is part of the justifying what you're telling them, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. You know, and so you can teach by experience, say, you know, I think you should rethink that. You know, let's find a solution to that because that won't work. You know, and I can tell you that because I've experienced it. You know, so you're handing down advice, but you're not really dictating, you know, this is the only way to do this. There are a lot of ways to do that, you know. But so getting people to start to trust their instincts and trust what they hear is a very important thing. And so I think that if you go back to the original question, how do you keep from hurting yourself? Practicing is a lot more about thinking than just mindless repetition. And you know, what's funny, and this happens at Curtis too, if you walk down the hallway and you hear people practicing, what are they doing? They're just playing. They're playing. And they're playing as fast as they can. Yeah. You know? And I'll say to them, you know, that's nice, but you're basically amusing yourself with the parts that you can play. And, you know, and you're not really working on the parts that you can't play. And so I say to them, you know, in the 20 years that I spent in these 4 orchestras, I had the good fortune, I guess you'd call it, to be able to hear the greatest of the great practicing backstage. Rostropovich, Stern, Kavakos, Anne-Sophie Mutter, Midori, Hillary, you name them, Yo-Yo, you know, all of them. Not once in 20 years did I hear somebody back there just going at this piece 100 miles an hour. Not once. They don't practice that way. If anything, they're like just connecting notes. How do I get from this note to that note? This is a little bit of an issue here. I noticed it last night in the concert. I need to cement this better. And that kind of work will never, ever hurt you, ever.
I always thought that, you know, one should actually sound as bad as possible in the practice room so that you get it out of your system.
Well, I mean, this is where you're like picking at things, you know. This is where you're kind of like trying to make it look more real, you know. Yeah. And look, I mean, I'll just give you one. I'll give you an analogy that's interesting sometimes for people to think about it. You know, if you have a sculptor, for example, and they have a piece of stone or a piece of marble, let's say, you know, it's a rough stone, it's a rough piece of material, yeah? But the sculpture actually is already in it. The sculpture is inside. So in a sense, the job of the sculptor is to remove the stuff that's in the way, right? Sure. Yep. And that's not that different than what we do when we learn a piece. The music already exists. You know, when we look at the score, the music is in there. These are symbols and they're signs that kind of tell you what stuff you need to highlight, right? So if you highlight these phrases, you will have the musical intention of the composer. And so when you look at what the sculptor is doing, at first, you know, they start with a big chisel and a big hammer and they're kind of taking out big pieces of stone, right? But as they're getting closer to the shape, which already is there, the tools get smaller, right? And eventually they may not even use a hammer. And maybe they're using like a pick or something like this to just remove the tiniest little thing. Yeah. And that's how we need to practice. You know, eventually, when you are starting to get closer to the end of the process with the piece, at first we're kind of like discovering things. We're just kind of getting things out of the way. You know, technically we're trying to figure out like, okay, well, this is difficult. This is how I negotiate this. This is how and so again, that's not 100 miles an hour.
Absolutely.
So in a sense, you could argue that the 100 miles an hour doesn't really exist as part of learning a piece. Because
Save
you don't
it for the stage, right?
Yeah. So you don't get close to the nose of this thing and take a big hammer and I mean, next thing you know, the nose is gone, and then what do? You know?
Right.
So it's a very interesting process that we have to think about. And if you think about the fact that the music is already in there, then when we practice, you know, and I think that, you know, again, practicing has two very different parts as far as I'm concerned. One is practicing the instrument, which has absolutely nothing to do with the Mozart concerto or the Bach or the Brahms or whatever. That's just practicing the violin. And that's, you know, just like the mechanics of playing the violin. You can do scales, you can do arpeggios, you can practice double stops, you can do etudes, you know, there's all of that stuff. And if you think to yourself, look, you know, I'm having trouble vibrating double stops of a certain kind. Okay, fair enough. There are thousands of things that you can do to just practice that. So that when you have to do that in the Tchaikovsky concerto, it's not a problem. But it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of energy to teach yourself how to double stop, vibrate double stops while trying to play the Tchaikovsky concerto at the same time. That's a very slow process.
So like building up a toolbox of skills that you can use.
Absolutely. I mean, what you want is to, you know, I try to spend more than half my time just practicing the viola. And then I practice, you know, a lot of times I'm thinking about a piece, you know, I need to, you know, and so that was back to the what and why, you know, I can, you know, I'm going to practice this little thing because it's out of tune, or I'm going to practice this little thing because I'm not sure that I'm getting this phrase to have the right shape. And so you tinker with it a little bit, you know. Okay. But that's not like learning how to play the viola while I'm doing that, you know. And so I talk to people about intonation all the time. If out of 10 notes, you play 3 that are always out of tune, so your intonation is basically 70%. It is not possible for you to play any piece better than 70% in tune. It is not. If your intonation is 70%, that's how you're going to play any piece is going to be 70% in tune. And so the best thing to do is to teach yourself how to play better in tune. And there are a lot faster ways of doing that than the Tchaikovsky violin concerto.
Yeah. Well, we had other questions that I think we already answered before they were submitted. For example, someone asked, how do you know which teacher is right for you? And I think what you said before, a teacher that can teach you how to teach yourself is really probably the best teacher there is, right? And I think probably when you go and have a trial lesson, or if they're willing to listen to you, they can maybe even give you a few words of advice
and I think, you know, and I think that, you know, a very good thing is to find people that study with that person and talk to them. You know, what are your lessons like? You know, and I mean, look, one of the things that we try to do at Curtis is, let's say that you audition and you're a violinist, okay? And you want to study with Midori. Sounds like a great thing, you know. And so, but you're not sure what kind of teacher she is. Well, fair enough. I mean, if you haven't experienced it, you should be wondering, would I want to study with her? I would like to study with her, but I'm not sure that she's the right person for me. So what we do at Curtis is we make it possible for you as a violinist, you know, if you have been accepted to Curtis, you can call the school, you can call the dean, you can write them a note and say, could I speak to a student of Midori's, please? Because, you know, one question that I would want to have answered is, Midori is a very busy person. She has a lot of concerts to play.
Right.
How many lessons are you getting? I mean, I think that's a very fair question. Now,
Yes.
it's not a question that you would necessarily be asking Midori, but you could certainly ask one of her students, do you get enough lessons if you study with her? Or do you have to also study with an assistant? And so the student will say, first of all, at Curtis, we don't have assistants. Many of us study with more than one teacher. So you can study with Midori and Pam Frank, or Midori and Ida Gavafian, or, you know, and that works out very well because, and then you'll also find out that Midori actually teaches a tremendous amount. She's constantly coming back to Philadelphia. She lives here now. She, you know, she'll play a concert in Berlin. She comes back to Philadelphia. She'll teach for 2 days, and then she'll go to Japan. You know, and then she'll come back from Japan, and then she teaches for a couple of days, and then she goes back to somewhere else. And so actually, she does basically all of the teaching by herself, which is, to me, it's remarkable that she does that. But I think that it's a fair question to ask someone. So at Curtis, we make it possible for new students to connect with the students of somebody that they would be interested in. And a lot of our teachers, Midori included, you know, and Ida Kavafian, and a lot of these people say, well, if you want to come to Philadelphia, which we think would be a good idea, you know, you could come to my studio class. It would be good for you to have a tour of the school because, you know, a lot of the people that get into Curtis also get into Juilliard, also get into New England, get into Colburn, get into, you know, and so they have a decision to make that's important. And so we say, look, these schools are all very different, and Curtis is not always the best choice for everybody. So, you know, you may want to experience the school a little bit. And, you know, if you want to see what a class with Ida Kavafian is like, then maybe you can come at a time when Ida is teaching a studio class, or she's doing a master class, or, you know, you should see a chamber music coaching. You can attend some classes, you can tour the campus, you can go to the orchestra rehearsal. Yes, the orchestra rehearsal. You know, and so you can see, you know, what would my life be like, and talk to people. Talk to everybody will talk to you. I mean, people are very easygoing, and, you know, you can talk to students with different teachers, and what is your life like? What is your schedule like?
Well, I think on that note, we could probably finish up today, because I think our listeners have just learned so many very useful tips and advice and just strategies about practicing, auditioning, and going to orchestra class, and why it's good to go and what you can get out of it. And just, I think, yeah, this whole idea makes me excited. I want to go back to school now too. Thank you so much. I think our most of the questions have been covered. Unfortunately, we can't cover all of them today, but yeah, I hope everybody got as much out of it as I did. And I'm sorry again to have gotten you up early on a Saturday morning.
No, it's 9 o'clock is not bad.
Yeah, well,
totally, I'm up, so no problem.
Yeah, and like you said, you know, Curtis has actually quite a strong connection with Hong Kong, and you guys were scheduled to come and probably will come eventually, I'm sure.
Yeah, we will for sure.
When you're there, I think we are all going to be there, and all our listeners, and
Great.
we're very excited to hear you play.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much, and you know where to find me. So if you need anything, just please let me know.
Great, thank you. Bye.
Bye.
So I'd like to just announce next week's for everybody. Not next week, but on July 4th, we have our next talk with Sarah Wedel-Wilson, who is the new president of the Hans Eisler School in Berlin, one of the most important conservatories in Europe. She was also the former head of the Mozarteum Music University in Salzburg, so from two very prestigious schools in Europe. And I think this would be very interesting for all of you who are interested to study overseas, because this represents a whole different system of music studies in Europe from America. You know, whether it's student life or the audition process, the tuition, which although Curtis is also free in Germany, in general, it's free everywhere. So, you know, I think this is going to be something very interesting for all of you to hear about. So please join us on July 4th at 8 p.m. in the evening, Hong Kong time. So hope to see you then. Thank you.